right, Erica. Nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you as well. So my name's Erica Bailey. I'm a rising fifth year PhD student at Columbia Business School. Prior to my PhD, I was a consultant at IBM for 3.5, 4 years. At IBM, I had a number of different roles, but right before grad school, I was managing a team of designers who worked with our sales team. So I don't know that it helped a lot in terms of my admission. Like, I don't think that Columbia cared that I had work experience, but it helped me a ton. I got a lot of really useful experience, like working on a team, working for a manager, doing things that like I actually study now is like, how do you be motivated at your job? How do you bring yourself to work? How do you, deal with a difficult coworker? Things like that I got to experience firsthand. So it helps me like phenomenologically to think of research questions. But relative to what we're going to talk about today, I also got a lot of experience with like, how do you manage a product? How do you get from point A to point B with a team? How do you like kind of rally around the timeline? And those are things I think have been extremely helpful for me in my PhD. And within academia, I study the topic of authenticity. So I study what makes people feel authentic and also what makes them seem authentic to other people, which are not the same thing. And within like organizations, I look at, how does that relate to employee performance and just the psychological kind of benefits of being authentic.
All right. Yeah. Super interesting.
Thanks. I think it's very interesting.
It's not a topic you come across every day. So especially all the topics that are related to psychology, like human brain, I'm super interested. And I'm sure your results will be, because it also like you're investigating the relationship between that, like its impact on the performance also. So that's also, I think, very relevant for a lot of organizations as well.
Yeah, I can share a little bit of like ongoing research, which I look at authenticity and performance. And it seems like people who are feeling authentic, they tend to just create a really good environment around them. So these are like the people on the team that you want to be around. They're very open. They're good at creating like a culture that's like open to change. It seems like they just have like a positive atmosphere around them. So they might not be like the best decision makers, but they're really good at motivating other people or setting the vision for the team. So that's a little bit of the benefits for being authentic at work.
Awesome. But as I was telling you before we started, I came across with one of your tweets where you were talking about the similarities and differences between academia and business, which I told you I found very interesting, because we're a startup working, building a product for academia. So I could really see a lot of similarities as well as interesting comparisons. So if you were to start, what do you think are the biggest differences between academia and business based on your own experience as of today?
I think the message I would want people to get is that they're actually not that different. They're incredibly similar. I think academics think of themselves as very different than people that work in business. But really, we have a product, and the product is a published paper. And our job is to get a lot of product, like a lot of output. You need a lot of papers, books, talks, impact. And that actually is very quantifiable. So someone I really like who talks a lot about kind of productivity in academia is Cal Newport. And in his most recent book about email, he talks about how like academics get so distracted by all these other things. But at the end of the day, your tenure case is decided based on the number of papers that you've written and how many times those papers have been cited. Yes. So it's like a very straightforward, like this is a number essentially that you're trying to get to. And that's something that I think businesses and especially startups have really done a good job at, like reverse engineering. It's like, okay, if our goal is user adoption, then we work backwards to try and get to that point. And I think academics could benefit from looking at their kind of workflow in that way. It's like, we need to get to this point, so now let's work backwards from there. I think in terms of academia, and it's going to depend a lot on people's programs because each program is structured really differently. My experience has been that within academia, it's a lot more, it's sort of like a lot more free. So you kind of like, you have this big research question, and then it's all this free flowing like decision making about how should we study it, what's the best context to study it, what kind of data would we want to answer this question, and it's a lot more open to like individual decision making,
Yeah.
which means that like the variances are much wider in terms of people's like successes or failures, because any like little decision that you make along that path could end up, you know, not working out. Essentially, like the biggest, you know, decision is like, what is your topic of study? Like,
Yes.
what do you want to contribute? And you could pick a topic that is very difficult. You could pick a topic that nobody cares about anymore.
Yeah.
And you could be really interested in it, but if the audience is not receptive to it, you're not, that paper, those papers aren't going to go through. You know, one great example of this is some of the researchers at Columbia, they study negotiations. And negotiations essentially like you have 2 or 3 parties and they're arguing about like how to get to a set, you know, agreement about a price or a location or features of some product. And essentially that is like a group decision making task. But in their experience, I won't say who they are, they told me anecdotally, like negotiations researchers are much more open to like creative tasks, to like understanding that some of the data sets are just like what's available, which is like classroom exercises and things like that. And they're much more open to like cool topics, whereas like groups researchers are sort of like, well, we know all of this already, you know, these are the paradigms we like to work under. And so that very small choice of like, where are you looking at this topic can actually impact your outcomes. And that's like, no one, you know, essentially that's the difficulty with academia is like, no one's going to tell you what the one right topic is for you. And part of it is like finding a topic that's a good fit, but that's a lot of ambiguity. And that's a really kind of intense open field for people to make decisions under. So I think academia is just much more directionless. Whereas a company, it's like, you know, for influencers, like this is a great example, like influence on whatever you want. If you get a certain number of followers, you can monetize that.
Yes.
And it's much more straightforward in that way.
Yeah, I think I would be completely lost if I were doing. I mean, I did my master's and then I was okay. That was still. It was exactly how you described it, but I know from PhDs, I mean, it's even more as you have described because that requires so much self-discipline. Not only when you're choosing the topic, finding out the topic, which is a challenge in itself, but also once you find it, having that consistent discipline. It's not a matter of motivation because if it depends on motivation, you will never be done with it. But really making yourself so disciplined across a year, like span of 4 or 5 years, it's really a hell of a task, I would say. It's
Yeah.
really challenging, but yeah, you need to develop certain skills to be able to achieve the,
Yeah.
you know, getting to the end.
And it's much more, I've noticed in academia, it's much more of like a plateau where essentially what you're doing as a late stage PhD student or an early professor is sort of like what you will be doing. It's like you're doing research, writing papers, and teaching. And that's just what you will be doing for the next 50 years. You know,
Right.
eventually maybe you'll run a lab, or eventually you kind of switch to the dean's office and you kind of switch roles in that way. But in a business, it's like, you don't like your job, let's move you horizontally, change a hat, change a team, change a product. And
Right.
I think when what you're doing is more consistent, it can be much more frustrating, or it can be much more stagnant. And so, but it's also more steady. So there's trade-offs on both sides. I think
Yeah.
it's academia is much more of a plateau. You know, you kind of figure out your space, you figure out the methodology that you like, and you kind of churn and burn from there. But that can get really stale. So it's not always
Okay.
the best.
I
You know.
understand. I understand. Perfect. Another question that I wanted to ask as I'm also going through my questions, one of the differences you mentioned was in KPIs, essentially having a set of tangible goals to track your, you know, your progress, your performance, to guide you in a specific sort of direction, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of KPIs would help, do you think would help PhD students develop a more disciplined action plan? As I was talking about discipline, more disciplined action plans towards their own goals, basically achieving the end, getting to the end.
Yeah.
And which ones did you use, or have you been applying in your own work that you found to be most useful?
Great question. So one of the frustrating things with like the your judgment of performance being based on getting papers published is that the process to getting papers published can be all over the place. So I have papers that I've been working on. I have one paper I've been working on since the very first day of my PhD, and I have other papers that essentially like came together and were sent out for reviews within like a couple months.
Okay.
And once you kind of get it out to review, it's just like you have almost no control over it, because it's going to go to reviewers that you don't know. It's going to go to an editor that you don't always, you can suggest who you want to be the editor, but you don't always know how it's being decided. And then in terms of what your reviewers will think of the paper, I mean, there's almost nothing you could do. You essentially write the best paper that you can, but you're giving it to someone else who has their own opinion, who has their own training, who comes at things from a very unique perspective. And that means that your paper can keep getting rejected over and over again, even though you think it's a really good paper. So
yeah,
one of the professors at Columbia, Daniel Kuhn, he had got a paper that kept getting rejected over and over again. And it was essentially like it was going to very similar people who were rejecting the paper over and over again. Or, if you're trying to bring a new perspective to a literature that's sort of old or established, I should say, your paper is going to those people who wrote the book on it. And so, of course, they're going to be like, no, I'm right.
yeah.
Anyways. So getting a paper published, there's a lot of frustrating pieces and steps along the way that you have no control over. So for PhD students, I think you need a metric other than the number of papers published to gauge your success. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of like the mice who they just feed them randomly. Like it doesn't matter what buttons they push or what levers they pull, they're just going to get random rewards. And like those mice start to lose it because there's no rhyme or reason to the rewards. And that's sort of how I feel with academia. It's like, you don't know like when you're going to get good reviewers, when you're going to get people who really take the time to give you a clear path for a revision. And so you feel like you're just running around. And so for me, and I just use KPIs. I mean, people had a really strong reaction to using that term on Twitter, but for me, it's like, okay, I need tangible things that I should be doing that I can track that will let me know I'm on the right track.
Right.
So I track things like, in my third year, I wanted to read one paper every day. And it's just, that's it. Some of the papers are really short. Some papers are really long. Sometimes it was things I'm interested in. Sometimes it was a speaker that's coming to, speak at Columbia, but just one paper a day. I wanted to sit down and read it to try and stay on top of what people are researching. Writing becomes a big task that people like to avoid because it's difficult. So writing for a certain number of hours, either a day or a week, that's something that I try and track, that I find super helpful at just knowing essentially like how am I doing along, these metrics. And then I think for me, presenting at conferences, it's a great time to kind of push yourself to get a paper to the working draft stage where it's like ready to be shared. And it's also a good chance to like get out there and meet other people in your space. So presenting at, X number of conferences a year, attending these number of conferences, that's kind of like quarterly goals. So daily, it's like, how many papers do you want to read? Maybe weekly, how many hours do you want to write? And then maybe some quarterly goal of, I want to submit a paper by the end of this quarter, or I want to present at this conference. That's twice a year.
I like the way you explained it, because just before you mentioned how open the academia is, right, compared to business. And as far as I can understand from you, these kind of measures, the actions that you took, under the KPIs are actually making just, you're setting tangible action plans for you, and then you
Exactly.
track them to see, to get you more disciplined, and then see if you actually achieved those. What were the outcomes? Did it help me like reach my final goal, which is publishing my paper at the end of the day, right? So we have similar things at our company that is being used by Google or many others, called OKRs. It's basically this key objectives, they call it. But it's the same. You set up a goal, and then you base all your initiatives according to that goal. Then if you're doing something that you see in that quarter are not touching on that goal, then you just remove them, and then you replace it with something like you said, reading once a day, or attending conference. Exactly the same, actually. Okay, posting on social media, or contacting X number of people. It's exactly the same thing, but in a different context. So I think it's very relevant. It makes a lot of sense, this KPI. Uh, it's basically like tangible action plans for you to
Yeah.
move in the right direction.
Yeah. It's just hard, I think, in terms of a PhD. It's hard to get feedback about how you're doing. It's hard to know how you're doing. And I think, if those are sort of things like reading papers and also just spending time writing. Those are things that like are almost never wasted. It's never going to hurt you to read another paper. It's just going to help you either learn the literature, or learn how to write, or learn about a new method. And then writing, even if you don't use that, what you wrote, it's just the practice of writing is really helpful, like long term. It's just a skill that you can build. It's like a muscle.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you for that. There was another thing that I really liked your comments about, which was the importance of project management skills that should be mandatory for PhD students. It was one of your tweets, actually, I saw.
Yes.
So I have a twofold question here. Which project management skills do you believe are would be most essential for PhD students, or even early stage researchers once they graduate? Because like you said, they keep doing the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then once you answer, I'll ask the second part.
So I think the two skills that are most effective, I don't even know if these are specifically project management skills, but it's just scheduling, time blocking, figuring out what to do with your day. And then prioritization. I notice with myself, and again, this is going to depend on the program. Some people work on 1 or 2 projects. I work on, more like 5 to 10, maybe even more. I know early career researchers who are in sort of social psychology world, or in management where I am, they're working on 15 to 20. And at that point, like, you have to know how to prioritize individual tasks and also individual products or projects that you're working on.
Okay.
And I'll give examples in your next question
Okay,
of what I do.
Yeah, my next question is, it's more importantly because, I just was very curious, like how you apply in your own experience on your own work. So it would be great to hear some examples so that listeners can also learn from you.
Yeah. So, and, I found that structure works really well for me. I just recommend like experimenting with yourself. Like, as academics, we love experimenting. And I'm like, try some of this out for you and see like what works well. The structure that I have is I usually start each week with a prioritization exercise. So I use a modification of like a prioritization matrix, where I have on the y-axis relevance for my particular research topics. Although I study authenticity, I have a bunch of other projects that are, sort of in a social cognition, perceptual realm, but are not necessarily about authenticity. And then I hope I said y-axis. I said relevancy. X-axis. Okay, good. X-axis is the stage of the project. So early stage or late stage. I've found that people, and this is true of business people and academics, is like we love the new shiny thing, and then we sort of get bored with the stuff we've been working on for a while. And so I then map both the relevancy to my research and the stage of the projects to make sure that I'm really focusing on this kind of top quadrant where it's late stage projects that are very relevant. And that's my top priority for the week. And so just laying out where are my projects at right now, just look at everything from the top down. And I just use like little initials and write them all out on my matrix. That helps me make sure that the majority of my time is up in this late stage, high relevancy quadrant. And essentially the projects which are down over on the opposite diagonal, which would be not relevant and early stage, drop them. Like, honestly, they're not helpful. And you've just started the process, which in PhD world could mean 5 to 10 years before that paper gets published, and it's not relevant for your research. So that's a sort of helpful like way to focus on what I should work on. From there, that's how I make my schedule for the week. And I use time blocking to say like these mornings I'm going to work on these specific projects. Within that time block is usually 2 or 3 Pomodoro sessions of like deep work. And that, of course, those kind of the way you get from prioritization to scheduling can be very idiosyncratic to what works for you. That's what I found is helpful. That way I'm not starting each day like, what is there to work on? It's like on Monday, I have an hour where I sketch out my whole week. I'm totally free to move those things around as things come up, or, you know, interest drives me. Like, you know, no one is holding me to this schedule, but it kind of stops that moment where you're like, what am I doing? Am I doing anything?
Yes.
Or what tends to happen is I have a hard thing like writing and I don't want to do it. So let me just answer emails instead, because that's easy.
Yeah.
And then I feel like I did something. Or you just do whatever you get emails about, which then kind of meshes up your prioritization. You know, that coworker or co-author that's really annoying via email who's just on top of you, they're going to drive your workflow instead of you driving your workflow. So those are the things that I find helpful. And I think in general, like going back to Cal Newport's book about email, like responding to emails quickly seems to like be the most important thing. But my job as a researcher is to conduct science and then to write about my results. And neither of those things involve emails.
Right.
So if I'm responding to emails, I'm actually not being productive.
Yeah.
If I'm reading your email, and especially if I'm responding really quickly, I'm in my inbox. I'm not in the Word document that I need to be in. And so I only check emails. I try and only check them within a certain time of my day. And that's really hard.
Yeah, I know.
It's really hard. I
know.
think it's hard because other people have the assumption that if I'm responding to emails quickly, then I'm really working hard. But I'm really trying to stress that with everybody else. Like, look, if I'm responding to your email, I'm not writing the paper for you that I should be working on. And so just, I'm in deep work essentially. So I haven't figured out the perfect way to kind of disseminate that, but that's usually what I do. I also find I have these worksheets that I got on Amazon.
Okay.
And it's just like a very clear, your top 3 goals for the day, one thing that you're thankful for. And you can also block your time on this little time thing. There's a bunch of different formats for this. I find it super helpful just for every day. I'm like a very tactile person as well. So I love like the day is over and you just rip that sheet off and crumble it up. It feels really good. Similarly, I can show you my project board. So I keep track of like where all the projects are. Pink are things I need to do, and orange are things I'm waiting for other people to do. So orange means it's essentially in a holding. And man, ripping these off when it's done and crumbling them up is such a good feeling. So yeah, that's something that I learned for myself is like, I'm really tactile. I need to see visually what I'm working on. And it's almost nice to feel it, to feel done. Like when the day is done and I rip that worksheet off, I'm like, whew, we did it. So that's just something I found that works for me, but I've infected my co-authors with the worksheet thing. A lot of people have gotten worksheets after I've told them. I just love it. I don't know what it is about having just a simple like notepad next to you is really helpful.
Interesting. I mean, I think what you just said is very interesting because there's a lot of research that has been going on about this. What you said about email, I'm the same. I've now started time blocking because I also thought the same at work. You know, you work with clients and then the perception is that, okay, if I reply as soon as possible, within 5 minutes, 2 minutes, immediately, then like, okay, wow, he's really responsive. I
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying I shouldn't reply for maybe a week, but nothing's gonna get mad at me. I figured if I reply during the end of the day, like at the end of the day. So,
Right.
and then the moment you're in a flow, like you said, and then you divert from that to an email or a Slack message or this or that, it's gone. It's
It's
gone.
over.
I get back, like I don't have it. So it's like I probably waste at least an hour if I can to get into that mode again. So I completely agree with what you said. I never thought of it from an academic perspective, but it is true. I mean, you need even more of your brain power, your creative brain power, especially when you're writing. So the moment you receive your reply to an email, you're just throwing it away, and
Exactly. Yeah.
your style is also super interesting. I mean, I talked to a lot of people, as I was telling you, and many say, yeah, they still work with tangible things that they can, cross out or things like that. But we don't, like at work, we usually try to use more digital tools because we work like in
Mm-hmm.
places. But the logic is the same. You break it into smaller pieces. So every time you cross out something, it gives you this feeling of accomplishing something. So instead of having this huge task, which never it gets done, So,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
so I feel you.
Yeah, I think too, in terms of like project management, like there are a lot of like methodologies that exist of like how do you want to structure your project. So, the two most popular ones would be waterfall, where like we're going to work on study one, finish that, write it up, then we'll go to study two and we'll run the
Mhm.
study and kind of do it sequentially. Or you could be agile, where you're like rapidly prototyping the paper and you're touching base every day and you have like a clear sprints of when you want to get certain things done. And there's trade-offs to both of those, but academics also just, at least I've never been in a conversation of like, how should we structure this project? It's sort of like, let's just get it done as fast as possible. But I can't get everything done as fast as possible. So especially when you're collaborating with other people, like how much time are you able to give to this project?
Mm.
What's your goal at the very beginning? Where do you want to go? Where do you want to send this paper? And that will just help kind of get everybody on board. I think if there's something that has a really quick turnaround, then maybe those scrum calls where you're just doing 5 minutes, what's everybody working on, to touch base are really helpful. And then everybody's doing their thing and we don't need to email and we'll check in tomorrow morning. Or if it's like the waterfall methodology, I know that they'll get back to me when this study is done. And so I don't have to worry about it. Essentially, like that it'll be 2 months from now, but I know what they're doing. And I know our next meeting will be about the deliverable of, how did the study go? Where are we at now? What's next? Yeah, it's just like, I think, businesses have thought a lot about this. Like, how do you get to the end point? And
Yes.
let's, at the very beginning, talk about how we want to get there together. I think that's super helpful for teams.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting, Erica.
Okay, I'm going to do three. I'm going to break the rules and give three
All right.
quick pieces of advice. I think the first thing, and this happens when I talk to like early PhD students or admits, is like they've just never been told that like you will be successful. And at this stage in your career, it's not about if you're going to be successful. Like academics are like so obsessed with like, am I smart? It's like, you're smart. Okay, it's just over. Like, forget it. You're done. You are smart. I promise you're smart. And now it's a question of like, how do you want to be successful? It's not if you will be successful, but in what way do you want to be successful? Do you want to write a book? Do you want to have an institute? Where do you want to make an impact? Not will you ever, am I ever going to be employed? It's like,
Mm.
at some point you have to just stop thinking in terms of like, if or when, and instead think about how do you want to be successful, and that can be an ongoing and developing goal, but it's just, I feel like it relieves some of the anxiety that PhD students have of like, am I any good? Am I smart? Like, you're smart. Now, what do you want to do with that smartness?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's number one. Number two is a business term, which is manage your managers. I think like mentor yourself. You know, if you don't get asked in your first year of your PhD what your 1 year, 5 year, and 10-year goals are, you should ask yourself that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I found that like if you don't drive yourself, you will get driven. You know, you'll get pushed into someone else's career path. Usually it's your supervisor or your advisor, like they just assume that you would want what they want. And if you never stop to really think about that, you could become them. And that might not be who you want to be. It might be, but it might not be.
Yes. Yes.
And then the last tip is just something that's been helpful for me. And that's find something outside of academia that you're good at and invest a little bit of time in that. It doesn't have to be something that you monetize. It doesn't have to be something that, you know, goes anywhere, but just knowing for me, like, you know, at the end of the day, I don't have to do this. At the end of the day, this is not the end all be all for me as a person, is so just relaxing, because then I don't have to cheat. I don't have to cut corners. I don't have to be a cutthroat person, because this is not the end all be all for my life. It's not I succeed at this or I'm a failure. You know, I'll find ways to make money. I waited tables for like 10 years. I could easily go back. They always need more servers. And that's also helpful. It just takes a little bit of the pressure off. Like find something else that you like, that you can invest your time in, that's a little bit different than academia, and it'll only kind of serve to make you a more well-rounded person. And in my experience, those people are also much more interesting to talk to. It's like, what else do you do besides write papers? I want to know, you know, you take salsa dancing classes, or you have a podcast, you know, those things make you just much more interesting all around. And that's what I think those people are the most interesting researchers anyways.
I can't agree more. But why do you think, because it's really surprises me a lot that a lot of people are so I wouldn't say obsessed maybe, but so so focused on it that they create a lot of pressure for themselves. Whereas, like you said, it's not a matter of whether they're smart or not. Yes, they are, but where are you going to utilize it? And for me, it's the same. Like maybe one thing's not going to work, but that doesn't mean that you are not capable of other things, either within or outside of academia. But why do you think there is so much this pressure that also results into anxiety, like mental issues for many?
You know, I think it's one of these narratives that we have. So I also study passion with a researcher at Harvard who's one of my good friends, Jan Yahimowitz. And I think we have this narrative that, like, if you just find, similar to authenticity narratives, if you just find your one true self, you'll be happy. With passion, like if you just find the one thing that you're passionate about, you'll succeed. But that can lead to exploitation, where then if that's the one thing that I'm good at, that's the one thing I can do, then your employer can ask anything of you, because you're indebted to them essentially. But yeah, I think it's this idea that we have that, like, if we could just figure out that one thing, then we would be successful. And the truth is, like, the things you're interested in will change as you change and grow. And I think that having like a flexible view of yourself, that you're always kind of in this growth state, you can always learn new skills, you can always find new things. And also, you know, there's a lot of things that will make you happy. There's a lot of careers that will make you happy. It's not finding the one, it's just picking one, essentially. Like, you have one life, pick the one that's going to get you where you want. Will you be right? Who knows? You know, if you're a multiverse person, then you can think in another universe, I picked a different path, and that Erica is happy too. You know, that's sort of how I try and think about it.
Cool. Thank you very much, Erica. That was really interesting conversation, and really enjoyed it. And thanks for all the insights.
Good. I hope it's helpful. I guess I should have said my advice should have been just be yourself, since I study authenticity, but I hope those 3 pieces of advice are even more helpful.
No, I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. Super. Thank you so much.
Awesome.